Actually, I should say not just what type of book is this, but what is it and what is it not? Most people claim that it's a spiritual autobiography. You'll run across a lot of scholars and teachers who say that, and that's true, but it's only partly true. It's also a work on economics, which we're especially going to see very early in the book. It's a work on humanity's relation to nature. What should our relationship to nature be, and what are the potentialities there? Taking its cue largely from Emerson, and what Emerson had to say was strongly influenced by Emerson, as you know from our last lecture. It also is a work that has something to say about time and space. That's kind of an aspect of the book that I've always thought people have overlooked. Prior to this, he wrote a work called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, and that was a book-length piece, and it deals very extensively with time and space and our relationships here in life and this life and the next life. It was not a terribly successful book. In fact, it was a miserable failure as a publication. In fact, the publisher in those days, because publication was so expensive, decided, well, I'll publish your book, but you're going to need to prepay for the first 1,000 or so copies of the book. The book was printed. Thoreau paid for the printing of the book. A couple of years later, the publisher wrote him a letter and said, would you mind coming up and picking up the extra copies that haven't sold from our warehouse? Tells you there that the guy knew that he hadn't sold very many copies. He went and picked them up, and there were 700 and some odd left that were not sold from the warehouse. Well, part of that was the publisher didn't really try very hard, but at the same time, he just wasn't a very successful author to begin with, and it didn't sell very well, and he was quite disappointed, obviously, but he had a pretty good sense of humor. And that is, when he got back home, lugging his books, swallowing his pride, he said, I am now the proud author. I am now the proud owner of a library of nearly 900 books, 700 of which I wrote myself. That's about as funny as you can get on it. But some of the things that he explored about time and space in his earlier work, which most people don't think is as great as Walden, he kind of brings back up, and it's a good thing he does because he's got a lot to say about it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. It's also a work about regeneration and renewal, very, very important. It's a work with lots of metaphors in it about regeneration. It's also most people don't think of this. It's a utopian work. This was an era where a lot of people were engaged in social experimentation, as we kind of mentioned last time in the lecture notes a bit. This was a period where people were starting new communities, and they were breaking out into different sort of social structures. They were trying to start new utopian communities. You know, there was Brook Farm, where writers and artists would go off and they'd milk cows during the daytime and supposedly have plenty of time left over in the evening to engage in their creative works. Didn't really pan out. Hawthorne even tried that for a while. Came home and said, once you smell like cow manure after shoveling you know what all day, you don't feel like writing short stories. It wasn't a success, but there were others as well. When you think about the Amana community, the Oneida community, the Shakers, all of these sorts of different kind of experimental utopian communities that popped up all over the Midwest in particular. You know, this was an era of enormous wild optimism where people thought we can reinvent society, we can reinvent all kinds of new cultural experiences for people. We can redefine the way people live their lives and such. There was even a community that was started by Louisa May Alcott's father and his associate Charles Lane. Bronson Alcott and Charles Lane decided to start a community called Fruitlands, where they only grew vegetables and fruits that grew upward towards the sky because that had positive energy. Nothing that grows down like carrots or potatoes and things of this nature. Only things like asparagus that grow straight up. Kooky stuff, I know. But this was a period where they really felt like we can redesign society. Some movements that are very prominent, very successful today, got their start in this era. For example, Mormonism is, in a way, a religiously motivated communal movement, and it was all about going out west and starting society over with a different structure, a different plan, a different purpose for living. And when we look at, for example, Karl Marx writes Das Kapital at about this time, the mid-19th century. And the communist revolutions in Europe are all about creating a commune. The Paris Commune, for example, is all about creating a new structure, a new way of life that was based on this tremendous optimism of the time. Well, here we're going to have a utopia, but guess what? True to his incredible independence, true to his somewhat irascible nature, this is a utopia of one. What is it not? Well, there are many incorrect assumptions about Walden. One, that Thoreau wants us all to go live in a cabin by a pond. This is nonsense. Every time you teach this to students in high school or undergraduate students frequently, they'll say, how can he expect us all to go live by a pond? Won't we be bored? What will I do without my iPod? All of these kinds of things. He is absolutely not, and he never says to anyone, I want you to go live like this. In fact, there's a passage, I'll point it out later, where he says, I would not want anybody to adopt my way of life if you didn't want to. It's also not some sort of cure-all for society's ills. People get carried away with the notion that, hey, romantics were quite anti-industrial, anti-urban, and so here he is living a very rustic lifestyle out in the countryside, away from the city. This must be some sort of statement that he thinks cities are terrible, and that this is how we're going to solve the problem of the Industrial Revolution. He's not saying that at all. He's simply saying, this is what I did. He never expects others to live like this. In fact, he even had visitors who said, show me how you're living, I want to live exactly like you. And Thoreau was quite consistent and said, why would you want to be a nonconformist just like someone else? That doesn't make any sense. It's a little hypocritical and oxymoronic, isn't it? But he did expect to live like this for a while, not for the rest of his life, but for a while. He said, this was a sort of time out in my life, and I wanted to get my head together, get my life together before I lived the rest of my life. We'll talk in a moment about why he felt that that was so important to do that. There were a couple of reasons, one personal and one cultural.